They called her a slave, chained her hands, branded her skin, threw her into the burning jaws of Cuba's sugar fields like she was nothing. But what they didn't see, what they never imagined, was that buried in her chest was the heartbeat of a storm. A woman carved from memory, shaped by fire, and carried across an ocean with her rage still intact. Her name was Carlota Lukumí, and though they ripped her body apart, her story still breathes. There was a time, deep in the belly of West Africa, when the trees still whispered old names and the rivers carried songs older than memory. A time when the land breathed through its people, proud, rooted, and unbroken. And among those people were the Lukumí, descendants of the Yoruba, whose hands shaped clay with grace, whose tongues spoke in rhythm, and whose lives were stitched with pride, tradition, and spirit. From this soil came a girl named Carlota. She was not born into chains, but into culture, into a world where drums spoke louder than words, where community was a blanket, and where every child belonged to a village, not just a family. Her name would one day shake the foundations of a distant land, but in those early days, she was simply a daughter of Africa, barefoot, brown-skinned, eyes wide with wonder, and laughter that echoed like bells in the Harmattan breeze. But peace is a fragile thing when greed sails the seas. One day, the sky stopped smiling. The raiders came like a plague, foreign tongues, fire in their eyes, guns spitting smoke, and hands greedy for flesh. Carlota was among the stolen, shackled before she could cry, herded like cattle onto ships that smelled of blood, fear, and rotting dreams. The transatlantic slave trade was not just a passage, it was a burial at sea. Burial of names, of language, of memory. She crossed the ocean in chains, a ghost of herself, bound for a land that did not know her, and did not care to. Cuba. A land drenched in sugarcane and sorrow. A Spanish colony where African backs bent beneath the sun, and African bones fertilized the fields. Here, enslaved people were not seen as human. They were counted, branded, and broken. Their worth measured not in heartbeats, but in how many rows they could clear before collapsing. Carlota was sent to one of the most brutal plantations in all of Matanzas, Triunvirato. It was a place where silence was survival, where women wept into the soil and men learned to swallow their rage. But Carlota was not born to kneel. Even with her feet in chains, her spirit refused to sit still. Triunvirato was not a plantation, it was a graveyard that breathed. Every morning, the horn would scream like a wounded beast, dragging black bodies from restless sleep into fields that stretched like punishment. The sun rose only to burn them. The cane stalks sliced their skin like knives, and the overseers' whips wrote bloody poems on their backs. No mercy. No pause. No humanity. The days bled into each other, endless and cruel. If your hand slowed, the lash quickened. If your voice rose in protest, the noose answered. And if a woman swelled with life, her womb did not earn her rest, she would birth a child today and return to the fields tomorrow, with pain still dripping down her legs. Even babies were not spared the cruelty. Infants were torn from arms that had barely held them. Fathers were sold without warning. Mothers wailed as their children vanished down dirt roads, never to be seen again. Families were not broken, they were shattered, crushed under the heel of profit. Carlota saw it all. But she did not let it swallow her. Somewhere inside her, beneath the bruises and silence, something refused to die. She remembered not just the faces of the ones she had lost, but the fire of the ones who came before. The strength of the women who had raised her. The pride of a people who had once walked free. The rhythm of resistance still thumped in her blood, quiet but alive, like a distant drum calling her back to herself. And in that place of horror, she found others who still burned. There was one, Fermina. A woman whose eyes didn't flinch when the whip danced past her ear. She didn't scream when others did. She watched, listened, remembered. She didn't speak often, but when she did, even the wind seemed to stop. Her silence wasn't fear, it was calculation. A map unfolding in her mind. While others waited for signs, Fermina created them. She passed messages wrapped in sugar leaves, hid machetes beneath broken baskets, turned the rhythms of the washing drum into codes of war. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her actions roared. Together, Carlota and Fermina became sisters not by blood, but by rage. They whispered between tasks, passed glances like flint striking stone, watched the guards, memorized routines. Their bodies were beaten, but their minds sharpened like machetes. They were not just surviving. They were waiting. Because Carlota had made a vow not with words, but with her breath. She would not die nameless. She would not let the cane fields swallow her bones. If she was going to fall, it would be loud. It would be fire. It would be a memory the soil could never bury. The winds of 1843 didn't come with rain, they came with something heavier. Whispers of rebellion were already stirring beneath the sugarcane leaves of Triunvirato. Carlota and Fermina were no longer just dreaming of freedom, they were planting it, one secret at a time. They met in the shadows. Passed messages in folded cloth. Turned chores into code, and silence into planning. Their rebellion hadn't started, but it had begun to breathe. Then came the fracture. Fermina was caught. Dragged from the shadows like a flame ripped from its wick. The soldiers didn't care who she was, only what she threatened. They beat her. Caged her. Showed her to the others like a warning. And some thought that would end it. But what they clipped wasn't wings, it was a fuse. Carlota didn't cry. She didn't run. She waited. And then she struck. She gripped the same machete they had placed in her hands to cut cane. And she turned it into a sword of reckoning. No overseer, no whip, no empire could have prepared for the fury that rose that morning. Carlota stormed the overseer's quarters like a ghost of every chained ancestor. She wasn't freeing bodies, she was freeing spirits. The first to fall was the guard. Then the silence. She lit the rebellion not with fire, but with rhythm. A drumbeat. A coded call. Other enslaved people joined her, not in fear, but with fists, tools, stones, and screams that had been buried for years. Then she turned her eyes to Akron. The rebellion grew teeth. At Akron Plantation, Carlota led the charge barefoot, soaked in rain, her voice cracking in both Yoruba and Spanish. She wasn't asking for freedom anymore. She was taking it. Enslaved men and women rose behind her like a wall of rage. No more whispers. No more waiting. The fields that once drank their tears now ran with rebellion. Overseers were dragged from their posts. Locks shattered. Whips silenced. Carlota's name rose with the smoke, not as a whisper, but as a warning. By dawn, the rebellion had spread like a brushfire across Matanzas. Plantations that once thrived on silence now screamed with war. Smoke curled into the sky like a flag of defiance. And the Spanish authorities? They scrambled. They panicked. They fumbled over the weight of a rebellion led not by soldiers, but by a woman. A woman. An African. A slave. Carlota. She wasn't just resisting. She was reshaping the land. But every storm has its cost. And though Carlota still fought, Fermina was gone. But not forgotten. Carlota stood taller. Her feet rooted in purpose. Her hands still planning. Her voice still reaching. And her blade still ready. Even with her closest ally gone, Carlota pushed forward. She freed those who still dreamed. She protected those who still shook. She refused to let the rebellion die quietly. Every step she took was a scar against the system. Every breath was defiance. But even storms can be hunted. The Spanish forces tightened their grip, fueled by vengeance and shame. They tracked her, stalked her, set traps like cowards in uniforms. And then they caught her. The earth did not tremble. The sky did not cry. But something heavy fell that day. Not just a woman, but a movement wrapped in flesh. Still, even as they bound her again, they couldn't break the truth. She had already planted the seed. And the soil would never forget her name. They dragged her into the open like a trophy of war, bruised, bound, but unbent. The air was thick with fear, but Carlota's eyes held no apology. She did not beg. She did not cry. She stared back at her captors with the fire they could never understand, the kind born from stolen homes and unburied names. The Spanish wanted a spectacle. Not just punishment, a warning. They needed every enslaved man, woman, and child to see what became of those who dared to dream beyond their chains. So they chose cruelty over bullets. They chose horror over silence. They tied each of her limbs to 4 horses, pulling in opposite directions, north, south, east, and west, as if trying to erase her from the earth itself. She did not scream. She did not plead. She faced death the same way she had faced her captors, with defiance carved into every inch of her. Then, the signal. The whips cracked through the air. The horses lunged. And her body was torn. Not just broken, but ripped apart in front of those she had fought to free. Blood soaked the soil she once vowed to make remember her. The cane fields watched. The wind stood still. Even the sky held its breath. They thought they had silenced her. Thought they had killed the rebellion with her limbs. Thought they had erased her with violence. But what they didn't know was that legends are not buried. They are scattered. And that day, as Carlota's body fell in pieces, her story rose whole. She became more than flesh. She became memory. She became fire passed from mouth to mouth, from village to village, from drumbeat to drumbeat. They had tried to kill a woman. But all they did was give her legend a shape. Carlota's blood did not vanish into the dust. It soaked the ground, seeded the wind, and began to speak through the land itself. Cuba did not forget her. Could not forget her. Though her body was torn, her spirit refused to scatter. Among the Afro-Cuban people, those whose backs still bore the memory of chains, her name became more than history. It became ritual. It became code. It became power. In the sacred spaces of Santeria, a religion born from Yoruba roots and African survival, Carlota's memory found breath again. When the drums speak, they speak of her. When the candles flicker, they flicker in her honor. When prayers rise, her name is stitched into them like a thread of fire. They say she became the storm that rides on Algun's wind, not because she was divine, but because her defiance was holy. She is remembered in the rhythm of the bata drums, in chants whispered over smoke and salt, in the sway of hips during Matanzas festivals, and in the hush of mothers telling daughters, "You come from strength." Carlota's name became a compass, a shield, a war cry. Africa has always had heroes. Not always dressed in medals, not always framed in books. But in chains, in soil, in fire. They lived. They bled. They rose. Their names were not etched in marble, but pounded into drums, whispered into winds, and carried in the hearts of the forgotten. Carlota Lukumí was one of them. A woman who turned a machete into a message. A voice the world tried to rip apart, but failed. Never forget her name. Because every time you speak it, you remind the world that Africa's daughters do not die quietly. They rise. Again and again. Until history is forced to remember.